well. So thank you all for attending.
Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome our guest today. Kenneth Ahern is an associate professor at the Marshall School of Business and a faculty and research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research is distinguished by the study of networks and to study how economic outcomes spread from one agent to another through interactions, including interaction among industries, individuals, and information sharing. His research has been published in leading finance and economic journals, including Quarterly Journal of Economics, Journal of Finance, Journal of Financial Economics, and the Review of Economics and Statistics, and has been cited in both popular press and legislative hearings around the world. Before joining USC, Kenneth was on the faculty at the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. He's got his PhD and his master's from the University of California, Los Angeles, and we're so pleased to have him on. Myself, Jackson, and David were able to talk to him within the last several weeks and get this all lined up for you. We're really excited to hear about the research paper that was so appropriately timed regarding St. Paul. And with that, Professor, thank you for joining us, and take it from here.
Thanks a lot. I really appreciate that. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present this paper. As academics, we often are in our ivory towers, kind of siloed away. So it's really great to be able to get some feedback from people who actually are putting are in practice and seeing this real effects in their daily lives. So let me share my screen. Oh, it says, can you allow me to share my screen?
Looks like Jackson's working on it.
Okay, great. I got it. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, super. So this is a paper that's co-authored with my colleague at USC, Marco Giacoletti. And I'm going to start out by just kind of giving this quote that I thought was really interesting, which says, "The economic principles of rent control are so obvious that one would feel the greatest reluctance to repeat them on the pages of a professional journal, were it not that a great public policy has been erected upon either ignorance or repudiation of them." What I found interesting about that is that this was written in 1950. So this is not a, even though it's like a hot topic now, even 70 years ago, the idea of rent control from an economist point of view was really pretty straightforward. There wasn't a lot of debate about it. And so the debate then becomes, well, why does this still happen? But we know that it still is happening. So let me give you a little bit of history of rent control laws quickly. The first generation was implemented during World War II, at a period in which there was a lot of mobility of people moving around the country, a lot of instability. Those laws were pretty quickly phased out in the 1950s, except in New York City. And that's where when people talk about the classic rent control, there still exists in New York City, that original 1950s law, though most of New York City's rent control today is a different kind of law. Most of it is not this original law. Then what happened was there was a second generation of rent control laws. That these are the ones that we're most familiar with probably today. These were laws passed by cities in states in Massachusetts, in DC, in California, in New Jersey in the 1970s. What was unique about these is that they were significantly weaker than that first generation of laws. They had lots of exemptions, pass-through of costs from landlords to tenants, vacancy decontrol, so that when someone moves out, you can reset the rent to the market price. But then after those rent control laws were passed, then there was a backlash to prevent those types of laws as well. So in the 1990s and 2010s, state governments were passing laws that prevented local governments from passing rent control laws. And in Minnesota was one of the early ones actually who passed a law like this in 1984. Although, as you probably know, there was an out for that as well, which was that if it passed by a ballot measure, then a local government could impose rent control. So we're actually now, I think, in a third generation of rent control laws, or at least starting it. So here's a table. Hopefully, it's not too small, but there are a bunch of recent laws that are being proposed. Some passed, some rejected, starting around 2017, 2018. And what's unique about them is first that they are passed at the state level. So California tried 2 times to pass a state law before they successfully did in 2020. The first state to do that was Oregon. They passed a law 2019, but other states have been proposing these laws, and they're pending currently. It's not surprising that these laws tend to come up when there's inflation or when there's a lot of instability in the country during COVID. So this is just kind of following the same pattern we saw before. What's also unique is that we're seeing rent control being passed in places that it hasn't been before. In particular, in Portland, Maine, passed a rent control law in 2020. There's more talk about it in Florida, and then where you guys are in Minneapolis and St. Paul, as you know, you passed some laws. So that was pretty unusual. The other thing that's unusual about, before I get to that, the other thing that's interesting to us was that the median rents in St. Paul, actually the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, were not particularly high compared to the rest of the country. So it's somewhat surprising that that was the place in which these laws were passed. This is a picture of nominal and inflation-adjusted rents for a two-bedroom apartment or two-bedroom property in the Twin Cities area, and you can see they're pretty flat, or if anything, they're going down. And if you look across all cities in the country, the price for rent to income is not particularly high in the Twin Cities area either. So it's an interesting place that this was passed. It's also interesting in that the St. Paul rent control law was pretty strict. As you know, is passed by a ballot measure. But what's unique is that it had a 3% cap on rental increases without any inflation adjustments. It has no vacancy decontrol. It had no exemptions for property types like single family residences, or for different types of owners like small owners, no exemptions for new construction. As far as I know, it was the strictest rent control law that was passed and since those early laws in the 1970s or in 1950s, it's probably the strictest. Now, as you probably also know, that there are these caveats in the law that give this language of fair returns that seem to have been interpreted in a way that is allowing for some exemptions, and particularly inflation adjustments, the way that they're interpreting it. That will remain to see, I guess, how it will actually play out. But what we want to do with this setting is understand how the St. Paul law affected property values in St. Paul, and then who gained and who lost from the law. So let me quickly give you a small lesson in economics. A rent control is just a price control. And price controls have two effects. They cause inefficiencies in outcomes. What happens is people, suppliers are less willing to supply at lower prices. So they will use other means to discriminate who gets their property. And I use that word discriminate purposely. We usually, in a free market system, you would allow the person who has the highest willingness to pay and ability to pay be the means to discriminate who gets the resource. If you limit that, if the law says you can't use that anymore, then what we know from prior research is that suppliers will use other means to discriminate based on things that they may they shouldn't be using, but there's still going to be discrimination one way or the other. So this kind of inefficiency is what we call a deadweight loss, which everybody loses because there's less supply. There's transactions that could have occurred that no longer occur because of the price control. There's a second effect, which is they cause transfers of wealth. So some people gain and some people lose. And it's possible, you could imagine a case in which the first effect doesn't exist. There is no deadweight loss. And all we're doing is transferring wealth around among the society. In that case, it's really not an economics question. It's much more of a philosophical or political question. Society might get together and say, this is how we want wealth to be apportioned among the people in our society. And rent control is one way to do that. So from an economist point of view, economists don't really care so much about that or have less to say about it. We care more about the deadweight loss. But it's still important to measure this and come up with to understand who is gaining, who's losing from rent control. So we're going to try to think about these two different effects separately, the deadweight loss part and also the transfer part. And then there's also another part that's specific probably to rent control, which is that there are these neighborhood spillover effects, that if the value of the property of your neighbor goes down for one reason or another, then the value of your property might go down as well, because there's an externality that the properties around you impact the value of your property. So we want to also try to think about that in our paper. Now, not to be too academic, but what we're really trying to do is our struggle as economists is to make sure we're isolating the effect of the law from other things that could be going on. obviously, many other things are happening at the same time. And so we're really worried that if we see changes in price, that they're driven by something not related to the law. So we want to try our best to isolate the effect of the law on the value of property. In a best case scenario, you'd run an experiment. You would randomly assign properties to be rent controlled, and some wouldn't be. And then you would say, well, did the price go down after you did that? If you think about in a laboratory, you'd give half the people a pill and the other people a placebo, and then you would know for sure, because you randomly assigned them, everything else is the same between those two subject groups. And then you would know if the pill did anything. In our setting, we don't have that. It's not quite the same because rent control is not randomly assigned. There's some reason why St. Paul chose to enact rent control and other cities didn't. And the worry is if those differences, those reasons also affect the value of the property, then what we might think of as the effect of rent control is really the effect of something else. There could be other law changes occurring at the same time, for instance, that could impact our ability to isolate the effect of rent control. So how are we going to try to address this? We're going to do the best we can to make an apples to apples comparison. So what we're going to do is compare St. Paul prices to real estate to prices in the surrounding cities. And importantly, we're going to exclude Minneapolis in this. Now, Minneapolis normally would be a great control because they're two urban centers right next to each other. But at the same time that St. Paul passed the rent control law, Minneapolis also had ballot measures on the same election at the same time, which could affect the price of property in Minneapolis. So as you know, there was a ballot measure for a Minneapolis type of rent control, though it was vague. It was just giving the authorization to pass rent control. But then there was also the law about mayoral power and also the law about the policing, the funding of the policing. And so if we compared St. Paul prices to those in Minneapolis, and we saw a difference after this ballot measure in November, we wouldn't know if that change in price was because Minneapolis passed or didn't pass the policing measure or the mayoral law, because those could affect the value of property too. So we have to exclude Minneapolis, and we're going to look at the surrounding cities, and I'll show you a picture in a second, that didn't really have any major changes at the same time. There were some school board elections, but nothing seemed too overwhelming. Whereas in St. Paul, all that really happened was this one ballot measure. So it makes it a very clean test for what we're trying to do. We're also going to control for the property attributes. So the size of the property, how old it is, what type of property it is. We're going to look within really small geographic areas. So we're going to look at within a zip code, within census block groups, which are very small. And then we're also going to control for downtown versus suburbs, because part of the problem is if we compare St. Paul to the surrounding cities of St. Paul, well, maybe it's that people don't want to live in St. Paul anymore because it's urban, not because of rent control, right? And so if people move out to the suburbs, as we saw in many cities during COVID, that could affect the price in St. Paul relative to what we would call our control cities. And so we wouldn't know then that it was the rent control law or if it was the change in preferences for urban versus suburban areas. So to control for that, we're going to look at 5 other cities and their urban versus suburban areas: St. Louis, Kansas City, Indianapolis, Nashville, and Denver. And so we'll see if there's a general trend going on from urban to suburban. And then we're going to use our baseline period of prices is going to be January 2018 to October 2021. And we're going to look at a pretty small time period, November 2021 to January 2022, just those 3 months. Part of the benefit of looking at a small time period is that we can be sure then that if we see price changes, it's probably related to that law, as opposed to something else. If we extended this out for 3 years, well, other stuff's going to change in those 3 years. So we're not sure if the prices are going to be reflecting the law, the rent control law, or something else. And because what we're looking at mainly are the value, the effect of rent control on property prices, we know that investors will be forward-looking. When they buy a property today, they're going to consider what the rents are going to be in the future. So even though it's very quick to look only within 3 months, what we're assuming is that investors are going to be forward-looking and build in the price changes, build into the price that they're willing to pay, the effect of rent control in the future. Okay, and we're also going to look at just control for average prices by year month, because there's just general trends in all cities based on inflation that's general to all properties. Okay, so our data comes from Redfin, which gives us square footage, address, property type. We're going to be looking, as I said, in this Twin Cities area, which are going to be the 5 counties surrounding the Twin Cities, Anoka, Dakota, Hennepin, Ramsey, and Washington. In our time period, that gives us about 150,000 transactions. When we include the other 5 Midwestern control cities, that's about 680,000 transactions over this time period. We're going to look at some rental data from Housing Link, which is a local nonprofit that collects data on rental prices. And then we also get data from the St. Paul Fire Department, because in St. Paul, if you want to rent a property, you're legally supposed to get inspected to make sure that your property is up to code. So we can identify which properties are rentals using that data. And then we'll also look at some parcel level data from St. Paul, from the Ramsey County. All right, so this is what, these are our sample, are in the Twin Cities area. So here you can see the black area, that's St. Paul, obviously. And then these are all the transactions that occurred in the outlying areas. And then we've blocked off Minneapolis. So we also do a test where we just limit this just directly to the closest areas just around the city borders to make sure that we're not comparing apples to oranges, because maybe downtown St. Paul is quite different than this region way up here, which you know better than I do. It's going to be a lot more rural and up there and compared to St. Paul. So we can also kind of change that to make sure our results are holding when we look just closely around the borders. So this is some summary statistics of our sample. We have the average price in St. Paul is about $280,000. Price per square foot is $174 per square foot. You can see, I won't go through it all because it's there. More importantly is that when you compare St. Paul to the suburbs, they're pretty similar. The price per square foot is roughly similar, $174 versus $165. You know, the properties in the suburbs are larger, but the price per square foot is smaller. That's pretty typical in most real estate areas. And then if we look at the comparable metro areas, you'll see those prices are pretty comparable too. The average price per square foot is $168 versus $165 in the suburbs. So these are pretty comparable areas, we think, as well, these comparable metro areas. In fact, the median price is exactly the same between the suburbs of St. Paul and then these other metro areas. So those hopefully will be a nice comparison group. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is just look at the price per square foot and compare that in downtown St. Paul versus the suburbs of St. Paul, and before and after the rent control law. So before rent control, as I just mentioned, these are the price per square foot, $174 versus $165 in the suburbs. And there's a difference between those two. These little 3 stars means that it's statistically significant, that this isn't just by random chance, that we can say that it really is more expensive in St. Paul, which is not surprising. So then the question is, when we go after rent control, in the post-rent control period, what happened to the prices? So in St. Paul, we see the prices increased by roughly $11, whereas the prices increased by $23 in the suburbs during that period. So that's a difference here of $12 per square foot. If you compare that to the initial 174, it's roughly about 7%. So in other words, if we thought that these two areas, the downtown area and the suburbs area of St. Paul, were both increasing at the same speed, then we should see no difference in this price per square foot over time. But we see the difference is that the suburbs are increasing at a price that's faster than than downtown. If we look at the comparable areas, those other 5 Midwestern cities, we don't see the same thing. In fact, we see the opposite. We see that the downtown area is actually increased in the post-rent control period at a faster rate than in the suburbs of those 5 areas. So if you were worried that, well, this is just a COVID-related change in preferences where people want to go live in the suburbs, and that's what's pushing the prices up there relative to downtown, that's not what we see in those other 5 cities. So it seems like the Twin Cities, St. Paul is different. And then if we do the difference and difference and difference, where we look at this 12 versus 3, it's $15 a difference. So if you compare that $15 to the original $174 per square foot in St. Paul, that's about 9% change. So based simply on this, which doesn't control for a lot of stuff, all it's controlling for is the city and the size of the property, it would say that we would expect the prices in St. Paul to have been $15 per square foot higher than they are currently, or than they were realized during this post-rent control period. So it seems reasonable that that's related to the rent control law. We can do this in a more sophisticated way where we control for a lot of things at the same time. So this is a regression result where we're predicting what the price would be of a real estate property, but we're controlling for all these things that are listed here. So the way to interpret this is to say, controlling for a property that's of the same size, of the same age, the same type of property, and in the same zip code or the same city or the same block group. This is the effect of the property being in St. Paul after the rent control was passed. So this minus 0.06. And it's very consistent whether you look within just zip codes or within cities or block groups, you see a 6 to 6.6% decline in property values in St. Paul after rent control was passed. So this is, if you just take all the residential properties in St. Paul and aggregate that up, that's about $1.6 billion decline in property values in St. Paul compared to these other properties. And again, this is saying for the same size property in the same block group or in the same zip code of the same age. So it's a pretty robust test. And it confirms what we saw when we just looked just as price per square foot, even when you don't control for these other things.
Professor, while
yeah.
we're still on that subject, Jerry raises a great question. Are we looking at all homes that are sold, or is this tied to rental properties only? Could you give us a sense of like the selection scope?
Sure. Yeah, that's yeah. Sorry, I didn't make that clear. This are all properties. We're going in a second. We'll identify separately rental properties.
Thank you.
But this is for all properties, and you might say, well, why should all properties decline in value if they're not rentals? Well, this goes back to that spillover effect, whereas that if properties decline because they're close to rentals, the value of rentals declines, then properties that are located close to rentals might also decline, even if they're not rentals. The other thing is about that is when we looked at the data, we saw that there's a non-trivial, non-zero probability of moving from a owner-occupied to a rental property historically. So historically, properties that are owner-occupied, they sometimes become rentals. So even if the property today is owner-occupied, there's still some value based on its rental value. And so we're going to take that into consideration. I'll show you some results when we think about that. Oops. So if we look at the other metro areas, just as, again, to test to say, well, maybe this is just some sort of preferences related to COVID during this time period, we don't find that. In fact, we find there's no effect between, if we just run the same test that I just showed you in each of those other cities, what you find is that there's no effect during pre-rent control and post-rent control, or I should say November, using that as a cutoff. There's no effect between downtown and the suburbs and those other areas. So it's something specific to St. Paul. Okay, and if you include those, and the effect gets a little bit larger, 7% to 8% decline in property values. So here's the question which is brought up: what happens when you look at rentals? So this is again a regression where we control for all those same things: the size of the property, the type of the property, the location of the property. And what this indicates is that if it's a non-rental, the price falls by about 5.7%. The rentals, however, have an additional loss of about 6.5%. So the rentals have a value loss of 12% in total if they're in St. Paul compared to not in St. Paul. So again, this is kind of, well, what is this, a spillover or is this a direct capitalization effect? Well, we see both, evidence of both. The fact that non-rentals are losing value suggests that there's a spillover effect even to non-rentals. And then there's also this direct capitalization effect, which is if it's a rental and the rents are capped, I can't charge as much rent as I would have been able to otherwise, the value of the property today is going to be lower. People are going to pay less to get that property. So we do run a little model. I won't bore you with the model, but we make a little theoretical model of the prices of real estate prices. And as I mentioned, we allowed for the probability of switching from owner to tenant occupied and vice versa, because historically you do see that. So historically, when you look in St. Paul, about 3% per year of properties go from owner to being tenant occupied. And then of those that are tenant occupied, about 13% switch to being owner occupied. Now, we also allow for the owners to change that probability. Instead of using historical probabilities, once rent control is imposed, we imagine that probabilities might change. People might be less willing to move from being owner occupied to renter occupied. So we match actually some data from San Francisco. And what we find there is that our best estimate is about, out of that value loss that we showed, about 67% of that is what we call a direct capitalization effect, meaning that the price is lower simply because rent control lowered the value of that property based on its future rents. 33% of it is based on this indirect spillover from neighborhood value changes. So this gets back to that original thing I mentioned about deadweight loss versus transfers. So our estimates say that about a third, or about 500 million of the total loss, is just a deadweight loss. It's a loss to society. It's not a transfer. And 2/3 would be a transfer of wealth from the owners to the renters. So let me then talk about how we think about this redistribution of wealth. So the rent control law was specific, and this is not unique to St. Paul, but part of what they're trying to accomplish in the rent control law is to reduce the burden of housing costs, especially for people in low and moderate income households, right? And presumably the people who would be paying for the law, or paying for to help the low income people, would be higher income people if the law was going to do what it's supposed to do. So we want to ask, does that actually happen? Are the people who are lower income, do they benefit more from the rent control than higher income households? So the way we try to do this is we estimate the value loss for all the parcels in St. Paul. So we get the parcel data from Ramsey County, and then based on the size of the property and the location of the property within the city, within a very small area, a census block group, which has, by the way, that's about 1,000 people or 400 households. So it's a small area within St. Paul. We try to estimate value losses for each property, and then we identify the demographics of the owners and the renters in the area. And then we're going to test whether the value loss in a certain area is larger in lower income areas. And the way to think about that is that value loss is a transfer. So the value loss is a loss to the owner, but presumably that's a gain to the renter because they're going to have lower rents in the future. So we want to see if the value loss, which we're calling the transfer, is bigger in the areas in which you have lower income renters. Identifying the owners and the renters is a little bit tricky. Identifying the renters is relatively easy. We just use the people who live in that area based on the census data. To identify the owners, we go to the parcel level, look to see where the owners live, and then try to separate out owners that are corporations from owners that are just small owners, small mom and pop owners. So if the parcel level data identifies an owner's address as a residential address, we assume that that's where that owner lives, and we can use their census data from that area to identify the backgrounds of the owners. Okay. Hopefully that's clear. If not, I can answer questions about that. So some statistics on the parcels in St. Paul. There's about 78,000 parcels, 73,000 are residential, 65,000 are single family, 90% of those are owner occupied, and then 7% are what we call a small landlord. That's somebody whose address is listed as a residence, and 3% are listed as what we call a large landlord because their address is not a residence. They're not necessarily large landlords. It could just be somebody who has a post office box or a UPS box, and that we wouldn't include them as part of our owner sample. The other thing is we have to exclude large apartment buildings when we do this. So anything over 4+ units, we have to exclude. We're really looking at 1 to 3 unit properties that are rented. And the reason is because in the parcel level data, they don't put square footage on these properties. So we can't really give a good price for these properties. So we're really focusing on small landlords in properties that have between 1 to 3 units. So here's a picture of St. Paul and where we identify the losses based on the census block group. So these are census block group areas. The red are larger losses, losses greater than 5%. And again, this is for all properties, not just rental, it's any kind of property. And then the lighter colors are losses that are smaller. So, you know, I don't know St. Paul as well as you do, obviously. I've tried to study for this paper, but when I look at this, it seems pretty random. It doesn't seem like this says, oh, all of the losses are in one part of the city and other parts have a lot smaller losses. Which was interesting to us. We thought we would see much more concentration of losses in certain areas, but we don't see that. So what we do to try to identify who's gaining and who's losing is we create these 4 subsamples. So we break down the areas by whether the owner is above the median and whether the renter's income is below or above the median. So this first column says, we're going to look at this subsample of properties in which the owners have high incomes and the renters have high incomes. And then we can do that these 4 different divisions. And the ones we're really going to be interested in is this one here too. This column 2 is we expect if the law was doing what it's supposed to do, to have the biggest effect. This is where owners have higher incomes and renters have lower incomes. And when we look at the value loss, again, this is our measure of the transfer of wealth. In those groups, in that column, or that group of high income owners and low income renters, that's actually where you see the smallest value loss. It's about 1%. Compared to where you see the largest value loss is the exact opposite, where the owners have the lower incomes and renters have higher incomes. So again, this is that value loss that we calculated, 6% on average. However, in the areas in which owners have low incomes and renters have high incomes, the value loss is closer to 8.5%. And the opposite, where the owners have high incomes and the renters have low incomes, the value loss is close to 1%. This is the exact opposite of what the law is intended to do. The law is intended to give the biggest benefit to the low income renters. And the ones who would pay for it would be the higher income owners. So we're seeing the opposite of that. And if you line that up with other demographic characteristics, you're going to see that it lines up very consistently with things that you might imagine, things like race. So in the areas in which we have low income renters, we also have higher minorities. We have fewer whites. You have less educated renters in those areas too. So if you break it down based on income, race, and education, that all lines up in that the law is targeting people who have, the law is benefiting renters that have higher incomes, that are more likely white and have higher education. And these are significant differences. So we do more tests than this, but that's kind of the easiest way to see this. So just to summarize the winners and losers, the renters who gain the most, as I just said, have higher incomes, they're better educated, more likely to be white. The owners who lose the most have lower incomes. You know, they're still higher than renters, but actually not just typically a whole lot higher in some of these areas. They have less education and less likely to be white. So the law is kind of has the opposite of its intention, has the opposite effect of its intention. Okay, so why is the rent control so poorly targeted? Well, it's not based on income. The law is based simply on all properties in the city. It's applied to all properties uniformly. There's no kind of income test. And rent control in this case is going to, in all cases, will have the biggest effect on the areas that have the highest future growth, because that's where we're going to see the biggest constraint imposed by rent control. And those could be, and in this case, seem to be the higher income areas. So in the higher income areas where we expect the future growth of rents to be the highest is also where rent control is going to have the biggest impact and benefit the renters the biggest. Another theory that we can't test is that maybe the low income tenants who are not gaining as much from the law might not be able to enjoy the legal benefits of the law relative to the high income tenants. Maybe the high income tenants know the law better and will make sure the law is enforced, whereas low income tenants might not. You know, there's certainly enforceability of the law that has to be taken into account here. And that might come from the tenants' resources to make sure the law is enforced. So we don't know exactly why we get these results, but the results seem to be pretty robust. So let me just summarize. So I want to make sure to leave time for questions. So what we find is that in St. Paul, there's about a $1.6 billion loss in property values That's about 6% for non-rental property values, 12% for rental property values. A third of that is what we call deadweight loss, just a loss to society. And then the remainder is a transfer of wealth, though that transfer is being targeted opposite to the intention of the law. So thanks. I look forward to your questions, and I'm perfectly happy if you challenge what we're saying. And that's how academics work. We want to make sure what we're doing is right. So I'll hand it back to you, Eric.
Great, thank you so much for that. We really appreciate the deep dive and the look into the data here. The 1.6 billion seems to truly track with some of the information that we were seeing locally on the ground here from November to January too. We had fourth quarter data that was showing previously applied for permits that were now being relinquished back to the city, and the value lost immediately on that was $950 million. So very, it's still very much in the same ballpark in terms of what we're seeing in terms of at least initial economic reaction to the law in St. Paul. At one point, you didn't get too far into this, but the one screen talks about policies from all throughout the United States. I know you're in California. California went through many iterations of this over a number of years to get to this point. But in your mind, are there some rent control or rent stabilization policies that might be better designed than others? Is a CPI type approach with a higher threshold, that 5% that you have in California, is that better off or worse off from an economic standpoint, from your standpoint?
Well, from an economic standpoint, rent control creates inefficiencies. And so when you put in the CPI allowance, that reduces the constraint that rent control is going to impose. So it would, an economist would say, well, if you're going to have rent control at all, at least allow it to adjust with inflation. It's interesting, actually, some cities in California have, they'll limit it to inflation, but there'll be less. They'll say you can increase the rent by 80% of CPI. So it'll always be less than inflation. And others say inflation plus 5%. So there's variation of that. But the other thing is about who gains and who loses. So there's some research that says it's important to means test rent control. So if you apply it broadly, as most rent control is, then it's going to benefit the people who probably have higher incomes. And again, our study is not the first to show this. It's studies that show this in New York City too. The people who benefited more were higher income people relative to low income people. So that might mean that if you want to make the policy better targeted, you have to have some sort of income testing. You're muted.
Thank you, Professor Ahern. Eric, if you don't mind, I am going to ask a few questions from members, and starting with Pat Paulson, who's asking, when comparing to cities out of state, did you control for seasonal impacts? The post-rent control period was during the winter months when our market slows down significantly. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do. We control for the month, the general trend within. So we're the prices in the city surrounding St. Paul have the same kind of seasonal variation as they would in St. Paul, more or less. And so we're controlling for that by just saying, well, what's the price on average within January versus August of the prior year? So we do control for that.
We also do have Quincy Ballard, and Quincy, if you're ready for it, I'm going to give you permission to ask your question live. You should get that notification now.
Thank you, Jackson. I appreciate it. And thank you for your presentation today, Kenneth. It was really informative. I guess my question is probably going to lean a little bit more to the philosophical or political side. And there's some assumptions here that when these policies are passed, the people that's pushing for them have done some level of research similar to what you just presented to us, and therefore may have some implications that we'll see some of the outcomes that you just pointed out to us. And I can't help but to think, like, historically, a lot of policies that have been passed have had the same impact on lower income, more diverse communities, and so on and so forth. So I guess that's my question: is do you feel like these outcomes are just coming out of ignorance, or do you feel like it's kind of some of the same old, and how the system usually impacts those same communities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's actually something we wonder a lot about. It's like the quote I started with, is it ignorance of the law or repudiation, ignorance of the theory or repudiation of the theory that would make people want to pass these laws? I think politics drives a lot of this. People pass laws for political reasons, and most people are not economists, and they may not understand these implications. They're not always obvious that when you pass price controls, what the consequences are going to be. So I think it's probably a combination of both. It can become a viable political promise. People, it sounds like it's a good thing, and so and it's also hard to show, right? Because when I presented this to people, they'll say, well, I don't understand what you're saying, because prices here are just going up like crazy and people are desperate to buy houses. And so a lot of economics outcomes are, well, what could have happened otherwise? This is what we're showing you is the alternative that you don't see. And it's hard for people, I think, to digest that sometimes, to say, well, the prices could have been up by 6% more than they are now, compared to what they are. Even though prices have gone up, they would have been up higher. So I think it's probably a combination of lots of stuff about education and also just political what works in politics and what doesn't.
I do have more questions. I know, David, you haven't had the opportunity to ask a question. Do you have one while I'm searching for a question from chat?
Top of my head, just intrigued and very grateful for the professor's work.
Thank you, David. I have a question here from Marvin saying, amazing research. Is the St. Paul City Council aware of this presentation in your paper? Also, this is a similar story with the other markets. Is this a similar story with other markets that put rent control into effect?
Yeah, so about the city council, I don't know. I try to follow what's going on there the best I can. It's not just, I've also been following this, the stakeholder group, the 41 members who have been debating this. So I don't know if they're aware of it either, but in terms of, is this something that's shown in other places? Actually, this has been shown. We worry as academics is like people like us, my colleagues are going to say, didn't we already know this? Why are you writing this paper? We think it's important. It's a new setting. It's a new, the law is different. It's one thing that's hard about this when you study rent control in general is that you don't have new laws. So what's unique about St. Paul is that you had no law and then you have a really strong law. So it helps to helps identify if something happened.
And to that point, Professor, and I know we've already had this conversation, but for the benefit of the audience, can you comment about the repeatability of a study like this in Minneapolis, like a year from now or not? We've talked about this, but
right. Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge, as I mentioned when I did my presentation, is that other stuff changed at the same time. So, when other stuff changes at the same time, you don't know what's really causing the price changes. And so what a lot of economists are really concentrated on is finding the causal relationship. And that's because we can't run experiments in a lab. We have to do a lot of what we can with the data, but also find situations in which the data will just give us a nice experiment. And so the St. Paul is a nice experiment. Minneapolis is not, because of those other ballot measures that passed at the same time. So, you can do the study, but there's going to be big caveats in which you'd say, well, is this because of something else that changed? One way that you could do it is compare probably rental properties to non-rental properties, because those laws that passed in Minneapolis at the same time, the mayoral power law and the funding of the police law, whether they pass or not, it could affect the value of the property. But you might argue that the funding of the police law, that should affect all properties, rental or not the same. And the mayoral power, that should affect all properties the same. So if you see a big effect for rental properties differently than you do for non-rentals in Minneapolis, that might be, it might be easier to attribute that to the rent control law.
In that same vein, Carson asks a question regarding your study. Will it continue now that more time has passed and we've implemented St. Paul's law?
Yeah, we might. It's not as clean a test in that we know now that the law has, it seems to me, has weakened considerably in the implementation of it and the enforcement of it. We don't really know how it's going to be enforced. So we might expect that the prices to go the other way, right? In other words, they may be a reversal back, because what we're looking at is what we think people are anticipating the law to be. Now, maybe people anticipated the law would be weakened, so that makes it hard too. But we just haven't we haven't done it yet. But we might do it. Some other papers that have studied rent control, they typically look at long time periods, which makes it easier to find things. But it's harder to know if other stuff's going on. So papers in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is an interesting case where the state banned local rent control. Even though the people in Cambridge voted to maintain it, the state banned it in 1994. So then the properties that were rent controlled became unrent controlled. So then they look 10 years later, well, what happened to the prices? And they can see these big effects. But you worry that over that 10 years, well, maybe lots of other stuff happened and you don't know if it's rent control. So that's what's really nice about having something so short in our view. And the shortness also helps us that to the degree that investors are not forward looking, if they're not aware of the law or they don't think too far in the future, then we really shouldn't see any effects, right? The effect should be zero because people are not aware of the law. So it makes our results more conservative. It biases against finding something by looking at a really short period of time. That was a long answer to your question, I think.
We got two more that just popped up. One from Cotty Lowry saying, you suggest that when a rental property that has been devalued by rent control, then contiguous single-family homes would also go down in value. However, single-family home renters are sold to owner occupants, aren't they? So wouldn't that actually raise value?
Well, so there's two reasons why the price could go down. So the price could go down because there is some chance that you rent it, or that local properties in your area are going down in value, and they could be going down because they're rentals. And the rent control has a direct effect. And so I didn't talk about it, but rent control tends to reduce the quality of property in a neighborhood, because if you can't charge more rent, then you reduce the upkeep as a landlord. So the quality tends to fall. And I think what you're saying is, well, if they're kind of insulated, if the properties are insulated, if in other words, you have miles of single family owner occupied rent homes, then there probably should be insulated. We shouldn't see anything. And that's probably true. But what we're seeing is that it seems as though these spillover effects are affecting properties all across the city relatively equally, which means that it might not be so much about my neighbor's property. It could be more about city services, say. Maybe the level of education, the quality of the schools go down because the quality of the taxes go down, or I should say the property values in some parts of the city go down, which has an overall effect on the whole city as a whole. We don't know exactly, but I think if you're saying that they should be somewhat insulated, I would agree with that. But it doesn't. We're finding that the effects seem to be spread over the whole city.
So there's some indication and sometimes some competing themes that are in the advocacy arena, at least, that get kind of tossed around. One is like the tenure of people in rent controlled properties versus non-rent controlled properties. Can you speak to that generally about what the research says across the country? And then some people also say, well, this might actually increase home ownership or potential total opportunities. Can you speak to those two things?
Right. Yeah. So we don't look at it in our study because it's too short, but other studies that looked at rent control's effect on mobility find that areas with rent control have less mobility. Now, you might think that's a good thing. And some advocates say, this isn't really what we were interested in is stability. We don't want people to be forced to leave if they don't want to. But what happens, the other side of that coin is that when you have rent control, people who otherwise should be leaving because maybe they're in a house that's got 4 bedrooms and they don't need 4 bedrooms anymore because their kids have gone to college, they tend to stay there because if they moved, then they would have a higher price to pay. So there's a misallocation. So it might be good for those people. They can enjoy their large house, but the other people who would benefit from having the large house don't get to have a higher price to pay, basically, because people don't move. So there's a mobility effect, which can have negative consequences. What was the second part? Sorry, I forgot now.
Like home ownership rates, impacts on.
Oh, right. Yeah. So if prices go down, isn't that good? If people would want to buy, then people can buy the properties. That's the argument, I suppose. That doesn't work if you have just a value loss. So you'd be buying properties that are worth less in quality. The reason the properties are going down, especially the single family owner occupied, is because the quality of the city, the neighborhood, the properties surrounding it are going down. So you're not getting you're not getting a deal. You're just decreasing the value of the property. That's kind of like saying we should force all cars to be, less quality and then they'd be cheaper and then we could all have more cars, right? Nobody would argue that that's an outcome that we'd want.
All right, it looks like we're just about at time. Thank you very much, Professor Ahern, for presenting and answering some of the questions that both MAR staff and MAR members have. It was a pleasure having you with us. This is for MAR members, part 1 of a 2-part open forum series. If you are a MAR primary or secondary member, you're welcome to join us. I already have your email in a appointment for another Zoom meeting, which I have just clicked send on. Check your emails right now and go ahead and join us over in the second MAR members only portion of this forum, where we can discuss internal aspects of this conversation and anything else that you as a MAR member would like to bring to the Government Affairs Committee. So a final thank you very much to our guest speaker, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you,
Professor. We're going to continue to follow your research too, and if there's changes along the way, please keep us updated, and we'd be happy to continue to follow and be your fan.
Oh, okay, thanks. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to present. Thanks for reaching out to me.
Thank you.
Right.
Appreciate
Good luck. See you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.